Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. I'm your host, Brianna Wilson. I'm a certified dementia practitioner and the founder of Bambu Care. So for today's podcast episode, I wanted to briefly talk about the tragedy narrative of dementia, what it is, the harm it causes, and then how we can find a balance between sharing our personal experiences without perpetuating stigma and the tragedy narrative. And really, I thought this would be a good episode to lead us into next month, where I will be doing a creepy critiques series, that's what I'm calling it, where I essentially break down important lessons that we can learn from films in the horror or psychological drama categories. Even if you don't like these type of films, which I completely understand, I highly encourage you to tune in next month because there are great lessons that we are going to pull from these films, okay? Now, before we get into today's topic at hand, if you like the What the Dementia podcast, please be sure to give us a good rating to help other dementia care partners find our podcast. We'd really appreciate it. And if you would like to keep up with us between episodes, consider following us on Instagram at Let's Bamboo or joining us in our free support community at letsbamboo.com/champions, okay? So what exactly is the tragedy narrative? Well, to put it simply, the tragedy narrative is the negative lens through which dementia is often viewed. Dementia is painted as this overwhelmingly devastating, tragic, and hopeless diagnosis. And the dangerous part about the tragedy narrative is that it strongly shapes how people perceive and then approach people with dementia as well as their caregivers. It really creates this vicious cycle of misunderstanding and stigma where the focus is primarily on the losses and limitations of dementia rather than on the remaining strengths and potential for a good life and meaningful connections. And the reason this is so important to understand and be aware of is because breaking free from the tragedy narrative is pretty essential to provide better care and support for individuals living with dementia and those caring for them. Now, in saying this, I am in no way diminishing the experience of many caregivers and even people living with dementia. There are many aspects of dementia that are devastating, tragic, and hard to experience or even witness. There's no denying that. But there becomes a problem when that stays the focus, when we aren't able to change out of our negative lens glasses and take on a different perspective so that we can see the fuller picture. Does that make sense? And I'm not just saying this because of my role as a dementia care educator or because I'm a dementia care advocate or any of that. You have to understand that the perception we hold of dementia and the people living with it strongly impacts how we treat both people living with dementia and their caregivers, even the support that is given from friends, families, healthcare professionals, the government. The way that you think of something is the exact same way that you will treat it. That's just the reality of it. And that doesn't just apply to dementia, that applies to all things in life, okay? So, as I was planning for this episode, I was trying to figure out the best way for us to discuss this topic in a bit more detail. And honestly, I think the best way will be to share a few quotes from people living with dementia. I think there's a lot that we can learn from their experience and what they share. Caregivers as well, but what I have are quotes from people living with dementia, so that's what we'll go with. So the first person says, "There is a stigma that goes along with the disease. Many people are worried about sharing the fact openly that they have this disease because of the negative stigma. I heard someone whisper the other day, 'My father has Alzheimer's.' I just gave him a big hug and said, 'You don't have to whisper, shout it out loud.'" Now, the first thing that stands out to me is that the stigma attached to dementia is so strong that it's recognized. It's not something that exists beyond people's awareness, meaning it's not just floating in the background going unnoticed. When people hear the word dementia or Alzheimer's disease, there's already some pretty strong thoughts attached to it. And if the stigma is so strong that people don't want to openly share about the journey that comes along with the diagnosis of dementia, or even that they or someone they are caring for have a diagnosis at all, people will be less likely to seek help, not even just after a diagnosis, but even before getting one. It becomes well, I know something's wrong, but I don't really want to know what. I mean, all forbid if it's the big A or the big D word. And this can set a lot of people back. One, because not everything that looks like dementia is dementia. And so people who may have treatable or reversible conditions end up closing themselves off from getting an accurate diagnosis and the proper treatment in a timely manner. And then after diagnosis, people with dementia or even caregivers may feel too ashamed to seek help and to be vulnerable with others, even those closest to them. Because now there's concerns about, well, shoot, what if it's not well received? What if people start treating me different? What if my friends abandon me? And these are all valid concerns because we hear stories of this happening literally every day. Even a person with dementia has been quoted saying, "Having dementia, I have lost friends and family members who don't want to know about the dementia journey. People often talk about me to others and not to me when I am sitting right next to the person." But why does this happen? It's stigma, it's the tragedy narrative. Like I said, it creates this vicious cycle, okay? Now, here's another quote from a person with dementia that highlights another issue. "After my diagnosis, my doctor just kind of let me go because he was of the belief that there was no treatment. He just kind of cut me loose. You have dementia and there's nothing that can be done. It's a progressive illness. Goodbye." Now, this is just terrible, but I hear more and more stories like this every day from both people living with dementia and those caring for them. They get a diagnosis and they are sent on their way with no information, no next steps, no recommendations for support, nothing. If they are lucky, they may get "oh, well, come back in 6 months and we'll see how you're doing." But what kind of crap is that? Again, if you view dementia as hopeless, you will treat it as hopeless. And this is what we see. The perception of hopelessness gets reflected back in the form of poor care and poor support. And this helps nobody. In fact, it often evolves into a self-fulfilling prophecy because when people don't know what to do, they don't know where to turn, they don't know what to do next, and the people around them are of no help, the likelihood of both the person with dementia successfully navigating their journey and the caregiver emerging from their journey in one piece diminishes significantly. And to be quite honest and quite frank, it pisses me off because it doesn't have to be this way. The idea that there is no hope after a dementia diagnosis is such a strong misconception. It is still very much possible to live a good life with dementia and while caring for someone with dementia. But the missing piece is knowing how and getting the proper support. A big piece that many healthcare professionals are dropping the ball on because of the belief that nothing can be done. If people don't think anything can be done, why would they waste time doing things, right? And then on the flip side, because dementia is viewed as hopeless, we have pharmaceutical companies who take advantage of this by offering that spark of hope for people because they know just how desperate everyone is for a cure. And unfortunately, when this is the motivation, it can get real ugly if I'm being honest. But I really do hope that you are getting my point here because I could literally go on because we see so many examples of this reflected in the everyday lives of people living with dementia and the people who care for them. But in efforts to keep this podcast episode a reasonable length, I digress. So, with us knowing what the tragedy narrative is and the vicious cycle it can create, what can we do on a personal level? Do we just pretend that dementia is all hunky dory? Absolutely not. That would be equally as detrimental, right? In my opinion, the best way that we can fight stigma and the tragedy narrative is by giving more of what's missing. So, not taking away anything per se, although I do think cautious use of language could be helpful, but at the end of the day, your experience is your experience. So, however that is best expressed, fine. But one thing that I don't see enough of, not in the news, not on social media, not in people sharing their story, not in people talking to the few friends and family that may stick around, is all the good moments, the good experiences, good support, good finds, good advice, good whatevers. The overwhelmingly majority of information and experiences shared is all negative, because those are the easiest to identify with. Why? Because it feels so heavy at times, and how could you not notice something so heavy? But, like I said, I'm not saying don't share the negative. That's important. However, if you tend to default to the negative only, I would challenge you to try to find the good in the journey of dementia. Now, this by no means is going to be easy because it first takes a perspective shift. It takes you thinking about dementia and the journey of dementia in a different way. So, baby steps is definitely going to be the way to go. But when you talk to others, when you share your journey, when you vent, when you reflect on your life, be sure to highlight some good as well, no matter how small it may be. The only way that we can end the vicious cycle of the tragedy narrative is by sharing the fullness of our journey and experience, not just highlighting all the bad that may come with it. But the only way that we're going to be able to share the good is if we take off those negative lenses every once in a while, okay? And though we as a society still have much work to do, we can all individually make small changes in our everyday life, changes in the way we think, changes in the way we talk about dementia, changes in the way we treat people with dementia and those caring for them, including ourselves. Because if we're being honest, we could all probably treat ourselves a little bit better. But if we can make these small changes, we can slowly hack away at the beast that the tragedy narrative has created. But that is all I have for this podcast episode. Hopefully, you found this podcast episode beneficial to you in some way and appreciated the perspective that I had to share. Remember to tune into our Creepy Critiques series next month. And again, if you find our podcast helpful, please consider leaving us a review to help others find the podcast. If anyone has any questions, comments, or future podcast requests, remember you can send us an email at podcast@whatthedementia.com. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. We look forward to catching you on the next episode. Take care, and until next time, stay strong, care on, and remember, you are not alone. Bambu Care is always here.